For more than 3 decades, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television, inviting millions of Americans into his living room through The Tonight Show, night after night. He laughed, listened, and exchanged banter with Hollywood's biggest stars. To the audience, it seemed effortless, a parade of charm and glamour, an intimate look into the world of fame. But behind Carson's sharp wit and knowing smile, there were secrets. Secrets he kept for the sake of careers, reputations, and lives. In his final years, before his death, Carson confided to a few close friends that he had long known the hidden truths of several of his most famous guests, stars who lived in fear that the world would discover who they really were. "Johnny knew everything," said one former producer who worked with him through the 1970s and 1980s. He wasn't just the host. He was the confessor of Hollywood. Celebrities would sit across from him, spinning stories about their marriages and romances, while Carson nodded knowingly. Many of those stories, he was well aware, were carefully constructed lies, fabrications built by studio executives to maintain illusions of perfection and traditional values. In those days, being openly gay could destroy a career overnight. Exposure didn't just mean scandal. It meant exile from the industry entirely. For Carson, the weight of that knowledge never left him. He carried those confidences to his grave, but toward the end of his life, he spoke more freely with his inner circle about what he had witnessed. He had watched stars live double lives, actors and actresses trapped in studio-arranged marriages, terrified that one unguarded word might expose them. What disturbed Carson most wasn't their sexuality, but the cruelty of the system that forced them to hide it. The deceptions were elaborate, the stakes enormous, and the cost in loneliness and self-denial immeasurable. The most shocking of Carson's recollections involved one of America's most beloved heartthrobs, Rock Hudson. In the 1950s and 60s, Hudson represented the ultimate fantasy. Tall, handsome, effortlessly masculine. He starred opposite Doris Day in light romantic comedies that defined an era, charming women everywhere with his easy smile and confident demeanor. But it was all an act, one crafted not by Hudson himself, but by the studios that made him a star. Johnny would sit there, smiling at Rock, asking him about his love life. His latest leading lady recalled a former Tonight Show writer, and he knew every word was fiction. Behind the scenes, the tension was suffocating. Hudson knew that Carson knew, and both men understood that one misplaced question could shatter everything. The host never betrayed him. He understood too well what would happen if the truth came out. Hudson's entire career rested on his appeal to women, on the illusion that he was the ideal heterosexual man. His agent, Henry Wilson, orchestrated every detail of his image, even arranging a marriage to his secretary, Phyllis Gates, to silence persistent rumors. The union lasted only 3 years, but in Hollywood terms, it had done its job. It protected Hudson's brand. Johnny thought those marriages were heartbreaking, said a close friend of Carson's. He saw them as institutionalized lying, a system forcing people to hide who they were to survive. For Carson, interviewing Hudson was always bittersweet. He admired the man's talent and charisma, but he could never forget the fear behind his smile. When Hudson died of AIDS-related complications in 1985, he became one of the first major stars to be publicly linked to the disease. The revelation confirmed what Hollywood insiders had long whispered. Carson was deeply affected by the tragedy. He spoke privately about how the system had trapped Hudson, how decades of secrecy and shame had denied him the dignity of being himself. Rock Hudson's story was only the beginning. Another figure who haunted Carson's reflections was Cary Grant, the epitome of sophistication and elegance. With his refined accent, impeccable suits, and effortless charm, Grant had become the model for suave masculinity. Women adored him, and men admired him. Yet Carson knew the man behind the mask lived a very different truth. Grant had once shared a home with fellow actor Randolph Scott, a ruggedly handsome star of westerns. The two lived together for years in a Santa Monica beach house that became known among insiders as Bachelor Hall. They posed for photographs together, cooking breakfast, lounging by the pool, reading the newspaper, intimate domestic scenes that fan magazines published as examples of male friendship. To modernize, the images tell a different story. They reveal a couple hiding in plain sight. Johnny always found those photos fascinating, said one of his colleagues. He'd laugh at how the magazines presented them as two bachelors saving money by sharing rent. But the truth was obvious. Grant and Scott's relationship, though never publicly acknowledged, was one of the worst-kept secrets in Hollywood. Grant went on to marry 5 times, each union a way to maintain the image that the studio and the public demanded. Carson, who prided himself on sincerity in his interviews, found the arrangement deeply troubling. He understood that Grant's charm was a kind of armor, a persona crafted to protect the man-born Archibald Leach from a world that would never have accepted him otherwise. Privately, Carson sympathized with Grant's need for self-protection, but he hated the lie that surrounded it. Johnny would say that Grant had to become Cary Grant just to survive, recalled a friend. It was both genius and tragedy. As Carson aged, he grew increasingly introspective about his role in perpetuating these public myths. He realized that his interviews, his jokes, even his silence had all helped sustain the illusions that trapped so many stars. He hadn't meant to be complicit. But he couldn't ignore that his show had been part of the machinery that demanded perfection from imperfect human beings, the illusion of cute. The illusion of romance and normalcy reached its most intricate form in the story of Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, the pair long considered Hollywood's greatest love story. For decades, the two were celebrated as the ultimate example of devotion, the strong-willed actress and the steadfast leading man. Bound by love, yet kept apart by Tracy's refusal to divorce his wife. It was a legend, beloved by fans, endlessly retold by studios and the press. But Carson, who interviewed Hepburn several times, knew that the reality was far more complicated. He genuinely admired her, said one former staff member. But he always hinted that the love story wasn't quite what people believed. In Carson's private conversations near the end of his life, he described the Hepburn-Tracy relationship as a convenient fiction, a partnership that benefited both stars. For Tracy, a devout Catholic, it offered a respectable cover for living separately from his wife. For Hepburn, it provided the perfect explanation for her independence and her lack of traditional marriage. It was an arrangement that shielded them both from uncomfortable questions. It gave her freedom, said one of Carson's confidants. She could live as she pleased, spend her life with whoever she wanted. And the public would still see her as the devoted lover of a married man. Hepburn had long shared her life with women. Her close companion, Laura Harding, lived with her for years, and later, she maintained a deep bond with Phyllis Wilburn, whom some biographers described as her life partner. But the studio publicity machine never allowed that narrative. Instead, they transformed her friendship with Tracy into Hollywood's most enduring romantic myth. A story so powerful that it eclipsed the truth. Carson found the whole thing remarkable. He thought Hepburn was brilliant, said one writer who worked with him. She managed to find a way to live authentically in small ways through her style, her attitude. Her refusal to conform, even if she couldn't live openly. Her preference for trousers, minimal makeup, and an androgynous look became a subtle act of rebellion. A quiet declaration of selfhood in an era of rigid gender expectations, to Carson. Hepburn embodied courage, not because she lived without fear, but because she learned how to hide and still be herself. Her strategy was simple but effective. Live privately. Keep the press at arm's length and let the Tracy narrative do the work of protecting her. It was, in Carson's view, one of the cleverest balancing acts in Hollywood history. As he grew older, Carson's reflections took on a tone of melancholy. He realized how many of the people he had interviewed were living variations of the same story, public idols trapped by private secrets. The entertainment industry that made them stars also imprisoned them in roles they could never escape. For Rock Hudson, the cost was literal life and death. For Cary Grant, it was decades of pretending. For Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, it was the sacrifice of personal truth for public legend. And yet, Carson never judged them. He admired their resilience. He saw the quiet bravery it took to survive in a time when being yourself could mean losing everything. Johnny was a private man himself, said one longtime friend. He understood the loneliness that came with fame, the pressure to always be what people expected you to be. Perhaps that was why he felt such kinship with those who lived behind facades. He, too, had built one of his own. In his final years, as he looked back on his life and legacy, Carson often spoke of authenticity. He lamented how Hollywood had built entire empires on lies, not malicious ones, but necessary ones. Lies that kept people safe, but small. Lies that allowed stars to shine while hiding their own light. He wished it could have been different, said a producer who visited him near the end. He wished those people could have lived the lives they deserved. By the time Johnny Carson passed away, the world had changed. The secrets that once could have destroyed lives were now, in many cases, openly discussed. But for the generation of stars he knew, the ones who smiled through fear, who played roles both on and off screen, the change had come too late. Carson never betrayed their confidences. But the sadness in his recollections spoke volumes. He had witnessed the cost of pretending, the toll it took on hearts and souls. In a world built on illusion, he had spent a lifetime talking to people who could never say what they truly felt. And in the quiet moments between laughter and applause, Johnny Carson, the man who knew everyone's secrets, carried them all, silently, until the very end. Johnny Carson's fascination with the private truths behind Hollywood's public faces revealed much about both the man and the industry that defined an era. Among the many stories he shared in confidence during his later years, few were as striking as his reflections on Marlon Brando. Those close to Carson said the host was intrigued by the contradictions that surrounded Brando, the celebrated actor who made a career out of raw, unfiltered authenticity while carefully concealing the most personal aspects of his identity. Carson had interviewed Brando several times and found him one of the most unpredictable and difficult guests he ever faced. Here was a man who built his reputation on exposing emotional truth on screen. Yet in life he hid behind layers of performance and control, particularly when it came to his sexuality. Brando's public image was that of a heterosexual conqueror, a magnetic figure whose affairs with women were widely reported and whose rugged masculinity defined a generation's idea of a leading man. But according to Carson's private comments, the host was fully aware, just as most of Hollywood was, that this image was at best incomplete and at worst entirely manufactured. Brando's romantic life was fluid, far less confined by gender than the studios would ever admit. Johnny would point out the irony, recalled one writer close to him. Brando became famous for bringing honesty to the screen. But in his personal life, he was forced to live a lie to survive in Hollywood. Carson reportedly found Brando's situation emblematic of the impossible cultural trap faced by male stars of the 1950s and 60s. Brando understood how to balance the competing demands of authenticity and survival, constructing a tough, virile image that protected him from scrutiny while still allowing glimpses of rebellion and sensitivity that broadened what American masculinity could be. Carson admired the sophistication of that balancing act, even as he lamented that it was necessary at all. Hollywood had created an environment where truth was dangerous and image was everything. Rumors, about Brando's romantic involvement with other men, particularly James Dean, circulated for decades. Carson was fascinated by this alleged connection, not out of gossip, but because of what it revealed about cultural myth-making. Both Brando and Dean were credited with reinventing the American male idea, raw, vulnerable, and rebellious. Yet both, Carson believed, had lived lives that contradicted the very image they projected. It showed how deep the divide was between what audiences wanted to believe and what was actually real, explained one NBC executive who remembered Carson's reflections. To him, it was both tragic and revealing that the two men most responsible for changing screen masculinity might have had to hide the truest parts of themselves. To do so, that contradiction became even clearer in Carson's thoughts about James Dean, the young star whose life and career burned out before he had a chance to confront the long-term costs of fame. Dean's legend was cemented by his death, but according to those close to Carson, the host was aware of the darker realities behind his rapid rise. While Carson never met Dean, he heard countless stories from the old Hollywood insiders who visited his show, and many of those stories hinted at the compromises Dean may have made to get ahead. Rumors persisted that the actor had formed relationships with powerful industry figures, most notably the director Rogers Brackett, who could open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Carson viewed these accounts not as moral failings, but as evidence of the systemic exploitation that shaped Hollywood's power dynamics. Young actors, especially those from humble beginnings, were often cornered into decisions that traded personal integrity for opportunity. Johnny never judged Dean, said one friend. He saw him as a product of a predatory system that rewarded compliance and punished authenticity. What struck Carson most was how Dean's untimely death erased those complexities. Death froze him in perfection, forever the rebel, forever pure, and shielded his image from the scrutiny that might have revealed uncomfortable truths. The legend that grew in the wake of his death became untouchable, an enduring example of how Hollywood could turn pain into myth when it suited its narrative. Marlene Dietrich represented the other end of that spectrum, a performer who managed to live more authentically within the same oppressive system. Her European sophistication and refusal to conform to its American expectations allowed her to blur gender lines and defy sexual norms in a way few could. Carson interviewed Dietrich several times and developed a deep respect for her courage and intelligence. He admired her more than almost anyone, remembered one Tonight Show producer. She didn't deny who she was. She simply refused to let others define it for her. Dietrich's style and persona turned ambiguity into allure. Her masculine tailoring, low voice, and air of mystery became central to her identity as a performer. Audiences saw her as exotic and daring rather than deviant, largely because her European background gave her a kind of cultural permission denied to American stars. Carson found this fascinating, how geography and accent could transform social transgression into glamorous rebellion. Her long, unconventional marriage to Rudolph Sieber provided a respectable facade, while both partners pursued independent relationships that reflected their real desires. To Carson, Dietrich embodied a rare kind of freedom within constraint, proof that authenticity was possible even in an industry built on illusion. That illusion reached its peak, in Carson's view, with actors like Raymond Burr, best known for his roles as Perry Mason and Robert Ironside. Burr was beloved for his commanding presence and moral authority on screen. But behind the scenes, he led one of the most intricately fabricated lives in Hollywood. Burr's invented biography included multiple marriages, a dead son, and wartime heroics, none of which had any basis in reality. Carson, who interviewed Burr numerous times, later described the experience as talking to a character someone had written. He understood why Burr had constructed such a narrative, but he found it heartbreaking. The man who made a career out of defending truth and justice lived his own life in fear of discovery, in private conversations. Carson reportedly reflected on the immense psychological toll such deception must have taken. Burr's life with his long-term partner, Robert Benavides, remained hidden for decades under the guise of a business partnership. To the public, they were collaborators. In truth, they were family. Carson saw this as one of Hollywood's most painful paradoxes: a man playing a truth seeker on television while being forced to lie about his own. Burr's story, for him, epitomized the emotional cost of living in an era where honesty could end a career. Equally complex were the lives of Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester, the married couple whose careers spanned Hollywood's golden age. To the public, they seemed a model of stability, two accomplished British actors sharing a long and successful marriage. But those within the industry, and eventually Carson himself, knew the reality was far different. Laughton was widely understood to be homosexual, and Lanchester, according to many accounts, preferred women. Their marriage, lasting more than 30 years, was both an artistic collaboration and a mutual shield. Johnny saw their relationship as a kind of genius solution to an impossible problem, said a writer familiar with Carson's private musings. They cared for each other, they worked well together, and they protected one another from a world that would have destroyed them if they'd been honest. For Carson, the Laughton-Lanchester partnership symbolized a pragmatic kind of love, one that valued loyalty and survival over romantic convention. Unlike the temporary lavender marriages orchestrated by studios, theirs endured as a genuine friendship rooted in respect and shared experience. Lanchester's later interviews, including her autobiography, hinted at this complexity without ever confirming it outright. Carson admired the subtlety with which she handled the subject, speaking truthfully within the constraints of her time. No story, however, captured the full irony of Hollywood's double lives more vividly for Carson than that of Cass. Hone Power. Power's face alone seemed made for the silver screen, flawless, symmetrical, impossibly handsome. His beauty made him a box office sensation, but also a prisoner of expectation. Studios marketed him as the ultimate romantic hero, a man whose desirability defined an era. Yet behind the publicity stills and fan magazine covers lay a private life far less conventional. Those close to Carson recalled him speaking often about Power's double existence, a daytime heartthrob and nighttime seeker of the kind of companionship he could never acknowledge publicly. Power's marriages, particularly to the French actress Annabella, provided the illusion of normalcy that the studio system demanded. They may have contained real affection, but they were also acts of necessity. Carson understood that such relationships were not simple performances. They were survival strategies. Johnny would say that beauty was both Power's gift and his curse, explained one colleague. It opened every door but closed off any chance at honesty. To Carson, Power's story illustrated how Hollywood commodified people as ideals, turning their faces and bodies into fantasies that left little room for humanity. When Power died suddenly at 44, his secret life was buried with him, sealed behind the same polished myth that had made him famous. Carson saw in Power's fate the culmination of everything he had come to believe about the entertainment industry, that it demanded the suppression of truth to maintain its illusions. From Brando's contradictions to Burr's inventions, from Dietrich's controlled authenticity to Laughton's protective partnership, the pattern was the same. Hollywood rewarded deception and punished honesty, forcing its brightest stars to live double lives. As Carson aged and reflected on his own career, he reportedly felt uneasy about his role in perpetuating those fictions. Night after night, he had smiled, laughed, and played along with stories he knew were half-truths. It wasn't his place then to expose anyone, nor would he have wanted to. But the burden of witnessing so much pretense in a profession built on charm left him contemplative in his later years. He admired those who had found ways to live authentically within the system and pitied those who hadn't in his final years. Johnny Carson understood Hollywood for what it was, a dazzling house of mirrors, built on stories that often concealed more than they revealed. He had spent decades sitting across from legends, each one performing not just for the audience, but for the preservation of their own survival. Behind the laughter, behind the applause, behind every carefully managed anecdote, he sensed the weight of secrets too dangerous to share. And though he never betrayed them on air, he carried those truths with him until the end of Private Witness to the real lives that existed behind the shimmering illusion of the silver screen.